Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Steve Vogel. I'm the chair of the Center for Japanese Studies. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here today. Today's event is sponsored in conjunction with the awarding of the Berkeley Japan Prize to Ryuichi Sakamoto, who you will hear from in a moment. I would like to thank some of our sponsors and collaborators, most especially the Japan Foundation, which has helped to sponsor this event. Also, I would like to thank our CJS Program Director, Kumi Hadler, and our Program Assistant, Alyssa Yoyama, for heroic work in making this possible. We do have a couple of official photographer and videographer, but I would like to ask the rest of you to refrain from taking any photos during the event or any videos. My job is to say hello and to exit quickly, but I'm going to introduce Professor Junko Habu, who is really one who has organized today's event. So it's really all thanks to her that this is happening. Professor Habu is a professor in our anthropology department. She is a specialist on prehistoric Jomon hunter-gatherers in Japan, East Asian archaeology, ceramic analysis, historical archaeology in Japan, archaeology in society, and I think, as you will find out today, she's also got a particular interest in sustainable society right up to the present, including current social movements. I think you'll hear more about that from her. So please help me in welcoming Professor Habu.
Thanks, Dave. Hello, and welcome to the Eco-Activism in Japan and U.S. Post-Fukushima panel. My name is Junko Habu, and I'm a professor of the Department of Anthropology. And as Steve said, I'm an archaeologist, but currently most of my time is spent to think about future sustainability. And it focuses on the importance of small-scale and diversified economies for the long-term sustainability of human societies and cultures. And in that context, I see archaeology as part of today's topic of how eco-activism is tied to contemporary society. And as a member of the Executive Committee of the Center for Japanese Studies, it is my pleasure to be your guide through today's panel. And the Center for Japanese Studies started organizing this panel to honor this year's Berkeley Japan Prize awardee, Mr. Ryuichi Sakamoto. And I'm really pleased that Sakamoto-san is here today with us, and he agreed to make a keynote speech for the panel. We also have three distinguished scholars, Dr. Fritjof Capra, Dr. Barbara Rose Johnston, and Dr. Brett Walker. And they will present their perspectives on past and present environmental issues. All of them are prominent scholars in the fields of environmental sciences, anthropology, and history. And I'm very excited that these people are all in this one room, and I will have the next 1 hour and a half devoted to the discussion. Now, an important reason for organizing this panel is the severity of the Great East Japan earthquake and the Fukushima nuclear plant accident of March 11, 2012. Following the earthquake, the news of tsunami victims and the Fukushima accident attracted worldwide attention. However, the information available in English was very small, even right after the accident. And I'm afraid that over the past 2 years, the news coverage in and outside Japan has significantly decreased. And I take this panel to be an opportunity to think about what citizens, students, and scholars in different fields can do to make positive changes in the post-3/11 Japan and the world. Now, before I ask Sakamoto-san to present his talk, let's take a quick look, really quick look at his work and his involvement in eco-activism for the past years. And I have 5 minutes to do that, which is not easy because he did so much. Okay. And as you know, Sakamoto-san, he was a founding member of the Magic Orchestra, and he did a number of film scores, including Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, The Last Emperor, The Sheltering Sky. And he did TV music, theme music. The most recent one is currently on NHK News. NHK, the Japanese broadcasting. And on top of all of his work, he is heavily involved in eco-activism in Japan. And we'll hear more about that from him, but broadly speaking, it covers 3 fields. The first one is to think about sustainable energy and environmental conservation. The second point is no nukes. The third point is humanitarian support after the 3/11 earthquake. Now, if you're a big fan of Sakamoto-san's music, I'm sure you have some of his CDs, and since 1994, most of his CDs are paper packaged, and these are some examples. He also composed an opera, and this happened in 1999, which raised an alarm over environmental degradation and the future of humankind. And in the process, he had a chance to meet with Dalai Lama, whose messages are incorporated into the opera. The use of renewable energy for his music tour started in 2001, including the use of solar, wind, and bicycle power. And in 2001, 10% of energy for the tour was renewable. By 2005, tours were powered 100% by renewable energy. He's also organizing a group called the Artist Power, group of artists promoting sustainable energy. And I saw him using his Facebook to collect most up-to-date information about the Fukushima situation and various environmental issues. So today's presentation behind him is over 500 people who are part of the network to collect up-to-date information. So I'm really impressed that he knows what's going on. I think he's one of the few people who actually knows real-time information, comes to him right away. And I think that power of internet and networks is something that we really need to think about. We can learn from him how to do it, actually. In addition, he did scores for anti-nuclear films, including Alexei and the Spring. And he started the Stop Rokkasho movement in 2006. Rokkasho is the name of a nuclear fuel reprocessing plant in Aomori. He is involved in a number of environmental conservation movements, including More Trees, initiative to support forestation in Japan and beyond, humanitarian support after 3/11, including the Kizuna World, Life 3/11, and School Music Revival Project, in which the project support over 1,800 schools to repair musical instruments damaged by the 3/11 earthquake. He organized No Nukes Festival 2012 at Makuhari Messe in Chiba, Japan, which was a huge success, and he's planning another one this March. And overall, I am so impressed and happy that he's been doing so much. I knew a glimpse of what he has been doing because his names are everywhere on the media. With this panel's occasion, I had the opportunity to learn how much more he did other than what I originally knew. I have to say that because of the complexity of the Fukushima accident situation, Many scholars are unfortunately quite cautious about making explicit statements about the causes and consequences of the accidents. And as far as I know, I do not think the Japanese government issued anything not to say, well, you are not allowed to study about Fukushima. But I think a lot of the scholars feel uneasy about the situation. And this is, I think, what anthropologists call self-censorship. And I fear that this problem, I mean, we are in Berkeley, we can say what we think is right, and yet, even I have to remind myself, okay, I need to say what I think is right, what I can, and don't step back when you think something is happening. I really need to stand firm and say what I think is right. Now, Sakamoto-san is one of those who has the courage to do it. He and his friends said, well, if artists do not speak up, who else can? And I have to say, we are Berkeley scholars. If we can't do that, who else? And in that regard, I'm very happy to have Sakamoto-san here today. And so please welcome Mr. Ryuichi Sakamoto.
By listening to Haru-san's introduction, I'm becoming even more shy. Thanks for inviting me today. I'm happy to be here in the most radical and liberal town in the US. I will broadly describe my interest in environmental issues and my involvement in eco-activism. It's going to be double. But in 1991, when I was 39 years old, my youngest child, my son, was born. I wondered what would become of Earth when he reached my age, and whether it would still be a planet people could inhabit, as we do now. I became concerned about the Earth's environment and decided to do what I could. I changed the packaging for my CDs from plastic to paper. Later, I changed to biodegradable packaging. Through trial and error, I came to realize that environmental issues were related to issues of the economy and of poverty. In 1999, I put those thoughts into my first opera, first and only opera, Life. I met with the Dalai Lama, whose messages on environmental issues, perspectives on civilization, and philosophy of life are incorporated into the opera. I also used a lot of message from people like Lee Marlis, James Lovelock, and many others. Even though James Lovelock has become a pro-Luke. From 2001, I began to use electricity from renewable energy sources in my concerts. And since 2005, my concerts tours have been powered 100% from renewable energy sources. In 2006, I learned of the plan to build a nuclear waste reprocessing plant in Rokkasho village in Aomori prefecture. Shocked at the lack of a general knowledge about the dangers of this plant, so I began a campaign called Stop Rokkasho. I came up with the not very logical motto of no nukes, more trees. I asked over 50 designers to create original t-shirts. This is one of them. 2007, I established a new initiative, More Trees. Its goals include forestation, forest conservation, and carbon offsets, returning funds to Japan's depleted forestry industry. We are maintaining forests that have been neglected. On March 11th, 2011, a massive earthquake occurred in northeastern Japan with a tsunami that caused enormous damage. I was in Tokyo at that time. It shocked me to the core. After the accident at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, big efforts were made to make it appear that it was not that serious by the national, prefectural, and municipal governments, Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, and the media. They did not disclose information, did not evacuate people who should have been evacuated, and caused them to be exposed to radiation. That situation continues to this day. Immediately after the accident, no iodine tablets were handed out to residents, with the exception of just one town in Fukushima Prefecture. That effect is starting to show. Although TEPCO employees and US military forces did take iodine pills. This is a report there is a report stating that a much larger percentage of children in Fukushima have thyroid nodules and cysts than those near Chernobyl after the 1986 nuclear accident. It isn't too late. Shouldn't the children at least be sent farther away? It frightens me when I think of the conditions 10 years from now and 20 years from now. So nearly 2 years after the accident, 160,000 people in Fukushima Prefecture are still living away from their homes. Deaths related to after effects of the earthquake and the accident continue to rise. In Fukushima Prefecture, only 1,121 people have died, according to the Fukushima Minpo newspaper. If we applied the radiation level that was used to determine the Chernobyl accident evacuation zone to the Fukushima accident case, people living in a huge area that includes the Tokyo metropolitan area would need to be evacuated. In other words, not only Fukushima, but also a large portion of the Tohoku region, as well as the Tokyo metropolitan area, have been contaminated. Several tens of millions of people are affected by this. The accident has not been resolved. Even now, large amounts of radioactive material are being emitted into the environment. Having run out of space to store the contaminated water used for cooling down the plant, TEPCO has said that it is discharging the water into the Pacific Ocean. Of course, radioactive material that is emptied from the accident site goes out into the atmosphere and the oceans, spreading throughout the world as time passes. The damage will not be limited to Japan, of course, nor will it be limited to humans. So from the 3/11 disaster, I learned that my country doesn't protect its citizens. Is Japan really a country based on democracy? Currently, as a result of the Fukushima accident, over 70% of Japanese citizens support phasing out nuclear power. Nevertheless, the pro-nuclear faction is attempting to resurrect the operation and construction of even new nuclear power plants. There are people who still believe in the nuclear myth. I cannot understand this at all, but in their minds it seems that nuclear power is tied to the concepts of growth, prosperity, and victory. The mass media, with the exclusion of some, have not investigated those responsible for this accident, nor have they disclosed details of the accident. No one has been held legally responsible for this massive accident. Efforts to communicate Fukushima's conditions are being made mainly by internet-based independent media and citizens. But in Japan, unfortunately, the majority of the people still get their information from conventional TV and newspaper mass media. So we must protect the independent citizens' net-based media. If this outlet becomes controlled, it will be detrimental to giving us the truth. Despite this, there are some encouraging signs. Following the comments of Adorno, who stated, "Writing poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. I say, keeping silent after Fukushima is barbaric." In Japan, for over 40 years, since 1970, there have been no mass demonstrations until the Fukushima accident. But from March 2012, every Friday night, people gather in front of the Prime Minister's office residence, official residence, to demand a nuclear power phase out. These demonstrations continue to this day. It is very rare for the general public to express their stance in the streets in Japan, as they're not students or workers mobilized by organizers. I sense the budding of true democracy in this movement. In the summer, 200,000 people gathered at an anti-nuclear rally and demonstration. Contrary to my hope for a positive change, however, elections held at the end of 2012 resulted in an overwhelming victory for the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP. The LDP is the very party that introduced nuclear energy to Japan from the US under the slogan "Atoms for Peace" in the 1950s, and has promoted its use for the past 60 years. It bears the major responsibility for the Fukushima accident. But for many Japanese citizens, economic issues rather than nuclear energy was the major concern in the 2012 election. This is very disappointing. What the current LDP government is doing looks to be attempting to return Japan to the pre-World War II constitutional monarchy of the Meiji era through revision of the constitution and making the emperor the head of state. They are also seeking to obtain nuclear armament. This is a very dangerous state of affairs, which countries in Asia look on with alarm. Where is the new Abe government taking Japan? It is quite frightening. Humans do not yet have a way to dispose of nuclear waste and are leaving it to nature to decrease radiation levels. Finland is constructing its Okaro spent nuclear fuel repository at a place where the geologic layers have not moved for hundreds of millions of years. Japan, as you know, is where 4 plates collide, and one of the world's most earthquake-active places, where 25% of the earthquakes in the world occur. The Science Council of Japan has concluded that final disposal in Japan is an impossibility. Does that mean then that we should ask other countries to dispose of Japan's nuclear waste? This raises the profound ethical issue of whether it is acceptable to export toxic materials from our country to another country. To begin with, we should not have built and operated nuclear plants that we knew would discharge toxic waste that cannot be disposed of in our country. So even if we decommission all the nuclear plants immediately, but this problem would remain. So what can we do about this? In order for us to enjoy electricity for just a few decades, we are releasing toxins and leaving disposal problems for tens of generations of humans in the future. What inhumanity, what an unethical behavior. Japan is a country rich in potential renewable energy from wind, solar, geothermal, tidal, and biomass sources. Why do we fixate on nuclear power and not promote renewable energy? I think it is inefficient to generate electricity at a large power plant and transmit it through long cables to big cities. Instead, we should make regionally based distribution networks. I believe that in the near future, the norm will become to create where it is used, whether it be at residences or factories or offices. So we should not be using electricity generated by contaminating our land and exposing our children to radiation. Is it for the economy, for money? Is it acceptable to harm our children and contaminate our land for money's sake? It is not only humans who are affected, but also all species. At the core of all problems, not just environmental issues, is the issue of money. That our current system of money is not the only one available. It is possible to have a system of money that makes people happy. It is possible to change. The earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident of 3/11 gave me a huge shock, as if my face had been slapped hard. By living our daily lives surrounded by a man-made environment, haven't we forgotten that we are part of nature? I shuddered, realizing I knew nature's might and power. In ancient times, was the role of art, including music, to listen to the message given by nature? Might it be possible to use 21st century technology to resurrect the sensitivity possessed by our ancestors who lived in nature? Can we regain the ancient yet modern sense of the hunter-gatherer through the form of art?
I was a hunter-gatherer for 4,000 years, just in case you guys.
It is not that the environment is being destroyed due to the high level of civilization of humans. Isn't it rather that because humans are still immature and don't understand well the workings of nature, that we are destroying our environment? A new civilization is possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sakamoto-san. Many of his fans actually call him professor because he's so knowledgeable, and the Japanese name is Kyoju. So I would like to call Kyoju, domo arigatou gozaimasu. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Fritjof Capra. Dr. Capra is a physicist and system theorist. He is the founding director of the Center for Eco-Literacy in Berkeley and is a faculty member of Berkeley's Environmental Leadership Program at UC Berkeley. Dr. Capra is the author of many books, including The Power of Physics in 1975, which is like a Bible for many people who are really into environmentalism, The Web of Life in 1996, The Hidden Connections, 2002. And he is currently working on a multidisciplinary textbook titled The Systems View of Life, which is co-authored by Ryuichi, and it will be published by Cambridge University Press. Please welcome Dr. Capra.
Thank you, Dr. I'd like to say a few words about energy, and since I've been introduced as a physicist, let me begin with physics. Energy, as you may know, is defined in physics as the ability to do work. And it is therefore an indispensable prerequisite for any activity in natural and technological systems. Modern industrial society depends crucially on a continuous supply of abundant energy for its food production and manufacturing processes, the lighting and heating of our homes and cities, and for our worldwide networks of transportation and communication. The very fabric of modern civilization is sustained by massive flows of energy. Since all industrial and economic processes are powered by continuous flows of energy, the illusory pursuit of perpetual economic growth generates ever-increasing demands for energy. And as our access to cheap and abundant fossil fuels reaches its peak and begins to decline, our economic crisis and our energy crisis have become inextricably linked. The declining supplies of fossil fuels, however, are only one of many facets of our twin crises of energy and economic growth. We are also depleting numerous other natural resources, from water, copper, steel, to rare minerals used widely in the aerospace and automotive industries, as well as in the manufacture of solar panels, wind turbines, and energy-efficient light bulbs. Even more ominous are the multiple environmental impacts of unlimited economic growth powered by fossil fuels, resulting in deforestation, soil erosion, water scarcity, and massive species extinction. The most dramatic consequences, however, have been the diverse manifestations of climate change, as you know. Record heat waves, mega floods, and ever more violent storms, which threaten the existence of life as we know it on our planet. These climate catastrophes have made it imperative to drastically curb greenhouse gas emissions and to implement sustainable climate policies on a global scale. These considerations make it evident that our energy crisis is a systemic crisis requiring systemic solutions. Several solutions of this kind have been proposed by scholars and activists in recent years. Unfortunately, however, the systemic thinking necessary to design and implement them is still very rare among our corporate and political leaders. Instead of taking into account the interconnectedness of our major problems, their so-called solutions tend to focus on one single issue, thereby simply shifting the problem to another part of the system. For example, by producing energy at the expense of biodiversity, public health, or climate stability. Well, in previous decades, there was great hope that nuclear power might be the ideal clean fuel to replace coal and oil. But it soon became apparent that nuclear technology carries such enormous risks and costs that it is not a viable solution. Still, in 2001, the nuclear industry launched the idea of a nuclear renaissance, claiming that it can provide electricity, as they put it, efficiently, safely, and with no discharge of greenhouse gases or emissions. From a systemic point of view, it is evident that no part of this statement is true. As you can see on this slide, I have summarized the basic facts about nuclear energy in terms of 7 inconvenient truths, as I call them, taking a leaf from Al Gore. And I brought a flyer of a more extended version of these truths, and they are also can be found on the website of the Center for Japanese Studies. So just very quickly, the production of nuclear electricity creates significant greenhouse gases and pollution, if you take the whole production cycle into account. Uranium supplies are very limited. Construction times of nuclear reactors are prohibitively long. The problem of nuclear waste storage remains unsolved. Nuclear power and nuclear weapons are inextricably linked. New generations of reactors exhibit the same problems and are decades too late. And because of all these problems, nuclear power is not viable commercially, being unable to survive without massive government subsidies. Now, each of these 7 facts by itself is a compelling argument against nuclear power, without even invoking its tremendous health and safety risks. Together, they make an overwhelming case for phasing out nuclear energy and replacing it with cheaper, cleaner, faster, and safer solutions. Now, if these arguments are so compelling, why then does the nuclear industry still receive massive subsidies from governments in developed countries, while the nuclear option is eagerly pursued by many countries in the Third World? I believe that the attraction of nuclear power to many governments worldwide is twofold. The first is the sophistication and high prestige of nuclear physics, the scientific foundation of nuclear energy technology, combined with the belief, deeply ingrained in modern industrial civilization, that after so many scientific and technological triumphs, physicists and engineers surely will be able, eventually, to design and build safe nuclear plants. Well, this belief, even if it were justified, addresses at most 2 of the 7 arguments against nuclear power, and hence it does not stand up to a proper systemic analysis of the issue. An even more powerful attraction of nuclear energy, in my view, is the inextricable link between weapons and reactor technologies. The underlying physics and the required raw materials are the same for both. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower coined the memorable phrase, "atoms for peace," which Sakamoto-san showed on this American stamp. But today it is clear that the so-called peaceful use of nuclear power cannot be separated from its military use, neither technologically nor politically. Political leaders around the world are well aware of this fundamental fact, even when they profess or actually sincerely intend to develop their nuclear capabilities only for peaceful use, the allure of even the potential capability to build nuclear weapons, with all its associations of military might, secrecy, and prestige, is so strong that they seem to be incapable, with very few exceptions, of abandoning nuclear technology, even though it does not make any economic nor ecological sense. This idea came to me very vividly when I saw a report of President Ahmadinejad in Iran when they built their first centrifuges, and he had a picture of himself taken in a white lab coat, posing as a physicist or nuclear engineer, and he made a solemn declaration that Iran is now a nuclear nation. So you see, all this prestige of might, of secrecy, of power goes with it. Now, in the long run, nuclear power is destined to be phased out simply because it doesn't have a business plan. Indeed, since 2005, all US reactors have been subsidized 100% and still could not raise any private capital. In the meantime, renewable energy sources are sweeping the global energy market. In 2010, renewables won $151 billion of private investments and added over 50 billion watts, the equivalent of 50 typical power plants, while nuclear energy got zero private investment and kept losing capacity. Nuclear electricity now costs 2 to 3 times as much as electricity from new wind power. And by the time any new reactors are built, they will not be able to compete with solar energy either. The case against nuclear power gathered new and perhaps decisive momentum after the nuclear disaster in Fukushima. In the wake of this catastrophe, Japan announced plans to completely end its reliance on nuclear power by 2040. But as Sakamoto-san told us, the recent elections with the change of power cancelled those plans. However, Germany and Belgium are abandoning nuclear power. Italy cancelled a long-planned nuclear revival, and even France, the most pro-nuclear country in the world, decided to lower its dependence on nuclear power from 75 to 50% of total electricity demand. It is to be hoped that these moves will accelerate the much-needed shift from nuclear energy and fossil fuels to the sustainable, systemic solutions of the energy and climate crisis, which already exist, as Sakamoto-san also mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaplan. Our next speaker is Dr. Barbara Rose Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a senior research fellow at the Center for Political Ecology, and she's our own Berkeley PhD. Barbara is an environmental anthropologist who studies the relationships between environmental crisis and human rights. She often comes to Berkeley and she gives a guest lecture in Professor Laura Nader's class once in a while. And her current work explores the community dynamics of water resource management and the human environmental impact of the United States nuclear weapons testing program as conducted in the Marshall Island. Sorry. was a long sentence. In 2011, she was a recipient of the 5th New Millennium Book Award, Society for Medical Anthropology, for Consequential Damages of Nuclear War, the Rongelap Report, co-authored with Holly M. Barker. Please welcome Dr. Johnston.
Thank you. I must do a minor correction. I'm a UC Berkeley undergraduate. Just to say, for the undergraduates that may be here, there's much you can do and go in life, and I'm one of those. And it's a special treat for me to come back to Berkeley, especially as an undergrad, in one of those things. It's also a special treat to give lectures occasionally in Dr. Nieder's classes, as she was my teacher in 1970-something. So, it's a very great honor to be here with you. And it's a real obligation as well as an honor to talk about the Marshall Islands in the context of Fukushima. When Fukushima happened, 3/11, we had in this TV media here in the United States and worldwide, bringing all kinds of comparisons up for people to think about. Fukushima and Chernobyl, Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, Fukushima and all of these other nuclear disasters, yet you did not hear about Ground Zero. You did not hear about the Marshall Islands. And there's very good reasons why you did not hear about the Marshall Islands. As a nuclear disaster, this was the place where the United States especially learned so much about the power of nuclear and the dangers of nuclear. And they did so in a classified way. They did so in a way that allowed them to control public information and global information about nuclear. And it is the very beginnings of this artificial separation between militarism and energy, and this notion that we can have, at the one hand, nuclear militarism, and at the other hand, peaceful atomic energy. So, at the core, really, in the story that I'm going to tell you, is the story of how it is that we've been able to say, in the horrors that is nuclear disaster, that nuclear power is safe. Between 1946 and how do I do it down? I'm sorry. So between 1946 and 1958, the United States tested its dirtiest, biggest, most deadly nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. It was the Pacific Proving Ground. 67 atmospheric tests in Bikini and in Waitaki Falls, atomizing islands and blanketing an entire nation. The area of about Mexico. You think of Mexico, it's a water world, 22 atolls, a populated nation. And it basically, this is a picture from 1946, series of tests was to demonstrate to the world not only the power of atomic bombs, but also to answer certain questions like, how do we fight a war with atomic bombs? And to really come to terms with what they began to realize after firsthand walking the streets in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the deadly dangers of atomic energy. What does this mean in terms of radiation? What does it mean? It's not just blast. So the Marshall Islands became their living laboratory. Between 46 and 58, those 67 tests included the 1952 and the 1954 detonations of the world's first hydrogen bombs. This is an image from 1954, March 1st, 1954, of the Bravo test. This one detonation produced an area the size of LA, basically, would be what that equivalent was built specifically to say how much fallout and how deadly and dirty can that fallout be. That was the goals of the test. And in detonating it in a populated area, we can understand a lot of different sorts of things, especially if we study it. So the research that was being done was military research, but it was also ecological research, radiation ecology, and the movement of radiation through the environment, through the food chain, and as after this test we shall see, through the human body. All told, in these years of atomic weapons testing, between up to 1958, in the Marshall Islands, some just one isotope, radioiodine-131, the amount released 150 times greater than the 40 million curies released by Chernobyl. So if you think about all those comparisons that we had after Fukushima, is this Chernobyl? Is this Chernobyl? Is this Chernobyl? Well, we already know what this stuff does. And that's one isotope. There's over 200 and something, 214 isotopes, which are released in these detonations. And they're not simply just isotopes. It's particles, it's heavy metals, it's toxicity, it's a lot of different sorts of issues. So it's an immensely contaminated, immensely polluted place. The 1954 detonation occurred with people living about 115 kilometers downwind that were previously evacuated in other tests and not in this. And also a Japanese fishing ship, say it. Thank you. We're caught up in areas that were supposed to be safe zones and they were not. The populated atolls, some of the people were evacuated, some of them were not. The people of Rongelap were horribly exposed. 3 days of being in a fallout situation before they were evacuated. And once evacuated, they were immediately enrolled in a top secret project called Project 4.1, which was a pre-existing classified medical research program to look at the effects of acute radiation exposure on human population. In fact, before these tests, the scientific gee whiz wish list was if only we had a population of some 200 or so people who were living in a controlled environment, such as an island somewhere, who could be exposed and then we could document and study them over time. This is the community who were opportunistically released and enrolled into this study. Project 4.1 documented over a 2-year period the immediate effects of acute radiation. So this is where we got to understand initially when you heard of after Fukushima, the general information released, what radiation poisoning symptoms look like. These are the people who demonstrated it, at least to the United States. Beta burns, loss of hair, depressed red and blood, red cell and leukocyte counts, flu symptoms, nausea, so forth. Most importantly, though, if you look at that last one, is changes of the cellular level in blood and bone marrow. Now, this is documented from acute radiation exposure and also suggests what we understand now to be reasons why at a biological level we have intergenerational effects from exposures. Also, a whole host of, in addition to human subject experimentation, was the radiation ecology studies. So before even the 1946 tests, there was biological baseline conducted, surveys of the coral, of the fish, of the plants, and so forth, and background readings on how much radiation was present. And then after the tests, radiation ecologists came back to do the sampling and so forth. And again, the purpose was to study how radiation moves through the food chain and through the environment. What happens to the human body when you live in a radioactive world. And some of the things that they found for these people who live completely off the island resources, very similar to many parts of Japan when you think about this. Fishing, coconuts, coral, reef fisheries, kelp, and so forth, all being part of your diet. Water stressed. Water, there's no rivers, there's no lakes in the whole of the nation. All of your water comes from a saltwater lens that might be underneath the coral atoll, the coral island, or it comes basically, the majority of water, from coconut and fish. So that's generally where you're getting your water. And of course what they found was that radiation not only moves through the system, it bioaccumulates within the system. But among other things, for example, after the 1958 series, which had a lot of radio iron in that particular detonation, they found the presence of radio iron in goatfish, which is a common reef fish. And in studying it, they found that it bioaccumulated in certain organs of the goatfish. Importantly, they did not tell the Marshallese people this information, who eat goatfish. Right? And that news didn't come out until the 1990s when the studies were actually declassified. So classified research was a huge dimension of this whole story. The long-term study, not only the people of Rongelap, people of Utrecht, other communities in the northern atolls that were exposed, but then also people in the southern atolls who were forced as children, age-matched to the Rongelap community, to be control subjects. Now, this part of the story really resonates with what's happening right now in the Fukushima children issues. So they did these long-term studies, 4 decades. Once a year and then twice a year, 4 decades, coming in to collect samples and so forth. Invasive procedures, bone marrow samples, long bone radiation, x-rays and so forth, but also radioisotope tests, sampling of teeth and body tissues and so forth, without informed consent. and against their will, oftentimes forced. When the medical ship would come, kids would go hide, the police would have to come take them and literally drag them to be involved. What do they get out of the science? Well, among other things, our recognition of the relationship between radioiodine and thyroid cancer and thyroid disease came out of their experiences. But also a documentation of a whole host of disorders that you don't hear about, especially the way in which your system is challenged, your immune system is challenged as a result of radiation, but also the ways in which metabolic diseases began to crop up, which we now understand to be in part a factor of radiation exposure and in part a factor of the endocrine disruption and other toxicity aspects of what you're exposed to, and especially what you're ingesting. Not just from eating, not just from drinking, but from smoke if you're using between fires and so forth. So a whole host of problems occurred. Notably, what was acknowledged, again, were the cancers. And what was denied or considered not significant were the premature aging issues, the intergenerational effects, and especially the reproductive effects. This classified story occurs between the initial bombs in 46 and 1958 they quit detonating, but not until 1992 did they stop the human subject research. Not until 1994 did the information come out of all of this. And in censoring the knowledge of not only the adverse impacts of acute exposure, but the long-term chronic impacts of living in a radioactive environment of low-level exposure. In censoring that knowledge, they were able to control public perception and understanding of what is safe. And really, it was a key element of what it was that allowed the Atomic Energy for Peace project and the birth and growth of the nuclear energy industry to occur in that artificial division. So here you have a global look at nuclear militarism around the world, but it's important to keep in mind the inherent links. After declassification in 1994, and the Marshall Islands by this point was an independent nation. They were a territory of the U.S. during all of the nuclear weapons testing. And they became an independent nation in 1986 when Ronald Reagan came up with a compact of free association that said, in exchange for $150 million, you will drop your $7 billion in lawsuits and so forth in our legal system, and we will give you independence. And with that money, you can use that to administer through a nuclear claims tribunal. A grossly inadequate sum, as it turns out. I think about $5 billion in awards have already been demonstrated, and those awards include property damage, remediation of the islands especially. But the important thing I want to mention here is that in setting up this war, they also, in the Compact of Free Association, congressionally mandated an independent tribunal. And so the Nuclear Claims Tribunal was established, and independent science was commissioned to explore what the consequential damages of nuclear militarism are. It's a phenomenal, and again, a largely ignored reality. The personal injury awards, they went and did a nationwide survey for the first time and checked everyone's thyroid across the nation, not just the poor atolls that the U.S. said were exposed. What they found out in the declassified material was that the whole nation was exposed. And what they found in terms of personal injury awards, as you can see, 59% of those awards went to thyroid cancer, and that prevalence was nationwide. It wasn't just in the localized areas. Thyroid cancers, thyroid disease, hypothyroidism, all of which, by the way, inhibit hormone production, pituitary gland function, and so forth, and are a main causal factor for congenital birth defects. So it's a really related issue. Some of these other issues in terms of cancers make a lot of sense and are well known. The ovarian cancer number is especially significant because that was the only reproductive tract cancer that the Nuclear Claims Tribunal recognized. And they did that because the U.S. denied any relationship between radiation exposure and reproductive cancers, even though NIH, EPA, all of the other agencies in the U.S. now, when you look on their websites, well, that's one of the first things they acknowledge. But within the context of nuclear compensation, all of the other reproductive tract cancers are not considered compensable. Why? Because that opens the door for intergenerational effects. In terms of findings, what this independent tribunal did in bringing in a whole host of scientists to really pay scrutiny on the northern part of the nation for these broader health issues of the impacts of nuclear militarism, they found a whole number and host of important findings. Certainly fallout moves through the marine and terrestrial environment, the food chain, and the human body. The solution to pollution is dilution, which is the mantra then and still is, was demonstrated to be a fallacy in many ways, because when you really, really look at how heavy metals settle and then where they accumulate and concentrate, and the movement and tendency over time for greater levels of toxicity, it is a good reason why they classify this, I guess. In terms of other sorts of important findings, acute exposures are further complicated when followed by chronic exposure. And chronic exposure to low level, very important. Chronic exposures to low levels have demonstrable effect within your generation and within the next generations. So this is an intergenerational reality. It's best demonstrated by this image, and I apologize for the graphic nature. But this is reality. This is Utrecht Island, which is the next chain of atoll downwind from Rongeland, and where people were initially evacuated and then 3 months later returned because their population size was too large to use in the human radiation studies. And they were then served as the control group. And they lived in a very contaminated setting, and they still live there in Utrecht. This is a third-generation child, and 5 babies were born in 2004 with this hydrocephalitic condition. This is a picture that was submitted to U.S. Congress in Senate hearings in 2005 as evidence of the continuing adverse effects, none of which are compensated or covered or addressed, not only by U.S. assistance, but within the capabilities of the Marshallese system. So these experiences through independent science have changed and transformed local understandings of what a messy, nasty world they live in, but also global understandings as well. And it's also prompted a resurgent interest in eco-activism in the Marshall Islands and the Marshallese experience globally in nuclear activism. Important that Marshallese now are testifying with their own voice in the U.S. settings, but also important that they are doing this in the United Nations. So this past September 2012, Marshallese nuclear survivors were invited to and able to testify to the Human Rights Council and in support of a report that the Special Rapporteur for Toxic Waste and Environmental Contamination, Kaylin presented on his mission to the Marshall Islands in the United States. Did you hear about this? In fact, I'll bet no one has heard about it. In large part because the United States managed to squelch the media coverage of the first time ever Human Rights Council investigation into the human rights demands of nuclear militarism. The first time ever the United States had to be so scrutinized. In the hearing itself, which I attended and helped bring Marshallese people there to give their testimony, a number of nations stood up and supported the Special Rapporteur's conclusions that the humanitarian consequences of nuclear militarism produce profound environmental waste and toxic legacies that continue to persist to this day. The only nation, in fact, who rejected the report was the United States. Lessons from these Marshallese experiences some are very obvious. We're all downwind. You do not have localized nuclear disaster. Not when you have emissions that go into the troposphere, and not when you have emissions that go into the oceans. It's just not possible. Not when you have a global economy and we reprocess and process. Meaningful remedies require transparency, accountability, and effective actions, of course, that repair and restore. This is all great platitudes. Knowledge is power. But how do you get at those? How do you really implement that? And this is where the real lessons come out. Questioning the science that shapes those public health determinations of what is safe and what our safeguard policies are. Figuring out how to get at these different areas. The Marshallese now have gone all the way through the U.S. court systems. The Supreme Court denied them standing because they are no longer U.S. territorial residents. So they have no court. So they went to the United Nations, and they had their Human Rights Council thing, and the U.S. has rejected that they owe any reparations. They have no court of appeal. All they have left, and most importantly, is the world. And I think that in many ways that's an important lesson, because you go through these institutionalized governmental constructs to push and make the case. We need help here, we need attention, and formal governance is one dimension. But increasingly citizen science, citizen power, and the ways in which citizens of the world through their various organizations and relationships are rebuilding our notions of governance is really the answer. These are some of the key questions. So I wanted to thank you for this time. came with a postscript to say that with the whole paper again, and especially all of the citations for supporting documents and key web links will be placed on the Centers for Japan Studies. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barbara. Our last speaker is Dr. Brett Walker. Professor Walker is Regents Professor of History at Montana State University, Bozeman. He studies environmental history, the history of human health, and the history of science. His research seeks to understand how humans have altered the environment or have been altered by the environment across both historic time and geographic space. And I first got to know his work when I was doing a graduate seminar on the Ainu people in Japan, and he has this excellent book titled The Conquest of Ainu Land, Ecology and Culture in Japanese Expansion, 1590 to 1800. And then he published another book, The Lost Wolves of Japan. And in my mind, he was still historian working on several hundred years ago to the recent. And then I saw this book titled The Toxic Archipelago, which talks about industrial disease in Japan, including the Minamata disease and It-Heart disease. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Brett Walker.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Habu, and thanks to the folks at the Center for Japanese Studies, Mr. Sakamoto, and the fellow panelists. This has actually been much of a learning experience for me. My expertise is considerably farther back than what we're talking about. And when Professor Habu first approached me if I would like to be on the panel, I said, count me in, really not thinking about what I would talk about, but only because I'm such a fan of Mr. Sakamoto's music. So I thought this would be a chance to get him to sign a poster, which I did. And then I thought after that I'd just kind of think about what I wanted to talk about. And I thought what I would do is, rather than talk about nuclear power, because I really don't know a lot about it, what I would try to do is place Fukushima and some of the nuclear, anti-nuclear activism, but also the eco-activistic response in some kind of historical perspective, to maybe offer some clues about what new place Japan might have in the world when it comes to environmental activism. Because it occurred to me that as I looked at Fukushima, and I looked at some of Mr. Sakamoto's work in the environmental sphere, it occurred to me that there were other people in Japanese history that had been doing these things, but there was also something distinctly different, I think, about Fukushima and some of the lessons that it had to offer us. So I'm going to go through time and talk about what I think are a couple of key moments in Japan's environmental past. What were some of the people that responded to that, and what was the nature of the response? And then maybe offer some clues on how we might contextualize Fukushima and some of the eco-activism that's going on within Japan. So when I first started looking at Mr. Sakamoto's site, it occurred to me that the first instance in Japanese history that came to mind was an incident that happened in the 18th century. And I was talking with Professor Goto about this the other night. This had to do with a very odd famine that happened in Japan in 1749. Okay? And a lot of people don't know about this, but I've written extensively on it. And it was a famine that was caused by an overabundance of wild boar. Okay? It happened in Hachinohe, which is a part of Japan in the far northeast, but there were so many wild boar in the area, they ate the local peasants out of house and home, thereby killing thousands of peasants. Okay? Now, when I first came across this episode, I thought probably like you are right now, which is to say, how can you have a famine when you've essentially got an overabundance of pork chops running around? But the fact of the matter is there wasn't a lot of meat eating. People weren't very good at hunting them. Most of that meat was going to the samurai class and not the common people. And so this overabundance of this ungulate, this herbivore ungulate that was eating all the peasant crops, killed thousands of people in the area. Now, it just so happened that living in the area at the time was a country doctor, kind of a country bumpkin actually, but as it turns out a very intelligent man by the name of Ando Shoeki. Ando Shoeki. Unfortunately, I could not find an image of Ando Shoeki. I'm not sure that actually any exist. But when I Googled his name, Mr. Sakamoto's image came up, actually. So he might be the new Ando Shoeki. So after the wild boar famine, Ando Shoeki wrote very lengthy texts on environmental change within Japan. And what he focused on, what were some of the reasons behind the wild boar famine? Why were there so many wild boar and what was the problems? And his theory was this, that as Japan's economy began to change, and the pull of large cities like the city of Edo, which is presently Tokyo, and Osaka, and some of the other ones, right, they were demanding more and more people get into cash crop farming to make a living. Food production was moving farther out into the hinterlands. This was causing kind of monocrop agriculture in places like Hachinohe. They were no longer diversifying their crops to feed themselves, but rather they were raising soybeans to feed people that were living in the large cities. When those crops failed, or even if they didn't, they would export those crops to cities like Edo, while at the same time their own local populations were starving to death. And it was, I think, as Professor Goto rightly pointed out in our conversation yesterday, an example of a kind of internal colonialism, or a third worldization process that you see today, where populations around the world are being called on to feed the metropolitan populations of the world, oftentimes at the expense to be able to feed themselves. But Ando Shoeki is a kind of interesting figure because what he believed to be the source of the problem was what he called chokko, or right cultivation. And what he basically argued was that if everybody produced their own food locally, you wouldn't have this kind of problem that would sprout up. And I think, as we know from today's kind of environmental activism, this local production is becoming an actual critical part, I think, of environmental thinking around the planet. But importantly, obviously, his context was only Japan. He was thinking about the Northeast, he was thinking about problems with Japan's commercialization, and he was thinking about how to get people to produce food locally to avoid these kinds of famine. If he was a very local figure, and if he was concerned with agriculture and production and food sources, the next person that came to mind as I started thinking about Japan's environmental experience and some of the people, some of the eco-activists that have come out of it, was a gentleman by the name of Tanaka Shozo, who is a very interesting figure, kind of a complicated man, served in the government, did a lot of different things, but his reaction was to a pollution event that surrounded a very large copper mine in Japan called the Ashio copper mine. And this mine was a very important source of copper for Japan's modernization in the late 19th century. Copper is critical for electronic gadgets, but it's also critical in war making. And as Japan became a modern industrial power and began to spread around the world, Ashio was producing somewhere on the order of 82% of Japan's total copper needs. All of that waste and all of the erosion was being washed down the Watarase River Basin, where it was destroying peasant crops. Tanaka Shozo reacts to that, but I think his reaction is interesting because he wasn't talking about industrial pollution as a kind of global issue. He wasn't really even concerned with human health. What he was concerned about was the health of the Japanese empire, or the nation. Right? And I think the quote that I put up there, I think exemplifies that. At one time he writes, "Ashio pollution is the stain on the Japanese empire. If we do not remove it, there will be no glory or honor in our empire at all." And at one point he even makes the case that the Asahi, which is one of the premier gunboats of the Japanese Navy at the time, should actually go up the Watarase River and bomb the Ashio copper production area in the name of Japanese patriotism. But I've always looked at Tanaka Shozo as a kind of interesting figure because he understood that changes in the environment were dangerous. He understood what some of the consequences of industrial modernity might look like. But his context for eco-activism was a decidedly national one. He was concerned about the health of the Japanese nation state. He was concerned about the health of the Japanese empire. And therefore, he was asking that copper mining stop. But I think also, if it's one step along the way to where we are now, it is still decidedly different, I think, from the lessons that we might learn from Fukushima and Mr. Sakamoto. The next, and there's only four of these, so you don't have to, I'm not going to go through too many of them. But the third one that I thought that it reminded me of was Minamata disease. And Minamata disease is an interesting case study because it too is going to have congenital forms. So one of the problems with mercury is not only does it make people ill, because of the nature of organogenesis with the fetus and the nervous system in general, it causes very dangerous congenital deformities within children. And I thought to myself, what's always struck me about Minamata disease and the protest that follows it is that it was very distinctly about the individual body. So if Ando Shoeki was about cultivation and food sources for people, and if Tanaka Shozo was about nationalism and the empire and how environmental activism might strengthen the nation state and the empire, then it seemed to me that Minamata disease was about the individual health of the human being within Japan. And then one of the more, I think, grisly manifestations of this was the parading of congenitally deformed children during protest movements that would be both in Minamata but also in Tokyo. Oftentimes, children would be laid at the hands of corporate executives or laid at the feet of government officials to try to demonstrate just how porous the human body was and just how susceptible it was to toxins within the environment. And I think that it had a very individualized form for that reason. If you look at the work of Ishimure Michiko, for example, who wrote extensively on Minamata disease, they are individual tales of health. They are about the body and they are about the suffering of people. But once again, I think the lesson from this was very individualized to the Japanese case. It was about methylmercury poisoning within Japan. It was about the Japanese body that was being destroyed. And for that reason, it fit in nicely, I think, with a longer trajectory of environmentalism within Japan, which brings me, I think, to Fukushima and some of the lessons that have come out of Fukushima. But for me, the most striking one is that no longer is eco-activism within Japan, as it relates to Fukushima, decidedly about the individual body, nor is it about the Japanese empire or nation, nor is it about agricultural production. I think we have now finally transitioned where Japan and Japanese eco-activism is about a kind of global body, or global health. And I think the lessons for me that are coming out of Fukushima, when I hear the panelists, when I see the kind of work that Mr. Sakamoto is doing and other people, it occurs to me that Japanese environmentalism or Japanese eco-activism has now finally and convincingly gone global. Right? It has gone global. And I think for me the more interesting example of that, when I was looking to try to think of something interesting to say today, I was looking at Mr. Sakamoto's websites, one of them, and it occurred to me that if you look at the language is very much about how do you place the lessons of Fukushima within a global context. And if you listen to my fellow panelists, I think you can see that you can't do this without talking about nuclear power more generally and what the inherent problems are, both for human health, but as a system of energy in general, or, for example, drawing on the lessons of the Marshall Islands, or any other context. It's impossible to have a conversation about the problems of nuclear power without placing it in that kind of global context. And then as I listened to Mr. Sakamoto when he was talking, he talked about things like the damage of this is not limited to Japan, which is very much a kind of post-nation state way of looking at it. Environmental problems require that we transcend the nation as a way of viewing what the future of human health might be and look at these things in a broader global context. Mr. Sakamoto even said the damage is not limited to human beings, supplying almost a kind of post-humanistic way of looking at this. That for the first time we're talking about environmental problems that really do challenge some of the basic fundamentals of biological life on the planet, not just human jobs, not just human bodies, but some of the basic biology on the planet itself. There is a kind of myth with nuclear power that he pointed out, but that's not a myth within Japan. That's a global myth. That's a myth that we hear in the United States. It's perpetrated in France and Europe, but it's also perpetrated within Japan. So that myth as well is very much about the global community more generally. And then I'll just conclude by, I think, what is one of the more profound remarks that Mr. Sakamoto made, and that was the idea that we live in a world surrounded by the man-made. And that for that reason alone, it's too easy for us to forget what some of those implicit connections to nature we might have are, or that our bodies are entirely porous, and that the natural world is constantly flowing in and around us, but also through us every day in the food we eat and the air that we breathe. That pervasive man-made environment actually has a name now. Geologists call it the Anthropocene. Right? We have now, according to most geologists, left behind the Holocene and all of its geologic features, the most prominent being a natural world that was sculpted by natural forces like erosion and wind, to an environment now that has become so overwhelmingly man-made that it has the name Anthropocene. That finally, in the history of geology, the forces, the human forces that remake the lithosphere of this planet, have overwhelmed the forces of nature. And so I think maybe the most important lesson that we get out of this is as the Anthropocene is a global phenomenon, as it's affecting the planet at large, the kind of lesson that we're getting from Mr. Sakamoto and others about thinking globally, about thinking about the human place in the world and how we might affect it is maybe the most important lesson we're getting from this of all. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Walker. He actually gave this lecture in my class on Thursday, and we had an extended debate about the concept of Anthropocene. Are we moving on to that phase? Is that a pessimistic view, or is the nature actually striking back? And it was a fascinating discussion, but we have to have another opportunity to hear more about it. Now, we don't have much time left, but there are some faculty members from whom I'd like to solicit some comment. And first, I'd like to ask Professor Laura Nader of the Department of Anthropology. Laura, if you could say a few words for us.
First, I'm humbled and honored to be here and to have heard all of you today. It has stimulated some thoughts, some pessimistic, some optimistic. And maybe I'll say a word or two about that. Thinking also about what we need to do still. First, I do think we need to stop talking about science as if it were one thing. Stop talking about physicists as if they were one thing. And we need to talk about good science and bad science, and science that isn't even scientific. So that's really important to do, because oftentimes when you criticize something like nuclear, people say you're just anti-scientific, it's modern, it's progressive, and so forth. And they push this notion of progress. Secondly, I realize also that we have to come in through the back door, which is Honorable Sakamoto. The idea of art and music, back door. Rapping has alerted a lot of people around the world to issues that politicians won't talk about. But people hear it through the rapping. And so the back door also might involve not just bringing people who are healthy to Washington or to the United States so that we can see what we've done. Bring the kids with the horrible deformities. Let's take a look. We're in denial. The world is in denial. It's just too painful to see where we might be going. And I think that we're all wimps. All of us, because we're all complicit. We all buy too much, we use too much, we waste too much. And we have to address in a new way the questions of growth, the questions of progress. What is progress? Progress. Is there another kind of industrialization? Before Western industrialization, which is so wasteful, there was industrialization in India, for example, and the other civilizations. So we have to rethink. Even if we had all of the energy possible, we don't have all of the materials possible. Besides, it doesn't even make people happy. And now I notice there are a lot of happiness studies that show that all of the so-called civilized countries, they're on happiness drugs. They should be happy because they have so much. And then finally, Honorable Sakamoto, I suggest that you retitle your piece, Barbarism in the 21st Century. It's not civilization anymore. It's full circle. It's barbarism. And thank you all very much.
Thanks very much, Laura. Well, your suggestion is interesting because I see that different perspectives of optimism, pessimistic perspectives, and I think with all the problems we have, Mr. Sakamoto still is on the optimistic side, and I think he thinks we can still change things. And with that, I actually hope he'll maintain his title and do not change it. We'll see what will happen. And we also have Professor Dana Bantrop from the Architecture Department. She is one of the members of the Executive Committee of the Center for Japanese Studies, and her work involves in the conservation of energy from the perspective of an architect. And I hope that the comments will address some of the issues from another angle.
An intimidating act to follow. I was very struck by a statement that Mr. Sakamoto made that I'm sure each of us can say today. My country does not protect its citizens. I don't care where you come from. You can say that today. And then Dr. Capra spoke to us about some of the reasons that we feel this. He spoke about the way that power has accrued to the organizations that once were organizations we felt represented us. The government, the military, and corporations, the corporations that we buy from, but also the organizations that we often work for. And how we've become so distanced from these groups that they no longer represent our values or our needs. And that they seem to be engaged in an effort to control us and to control the world we live in, the natural world, in a way that's genuinely impossible and often leads to disaster. Dr. Johnston followed by talking about some of the ways that we become told we're powerless in this relationship. Talked about the way that information is controlled, so that we, like those people in Fukushima immediately after, don't know where the dangers are around us. We cannot see them. We cannot measure them. And no one tells us which way the wind blows, what we should take, what we should not eat. She also spoke, though, with hope about the concept of independent science. As scholars, I can tell you that all of us have a lot less independence than we used to have. We have less independence in our time. We have less independence in our support. We have less opportunity to speak aloud. But independent science still allows us, if we make the effort, to be informed. And Dr. Sakamoto, Mr. Sakamoto, although he didn't speak of it here today, has spoken elsewhere about the value of an independent media to help us find out that information. The part that he didn't say today is that there's a tremendous courage in the stance he's taking. That immediately after 3/11, many young musicians and many young artists stood up and said, this is wrong, and we're worried about our people. And you know what happened? Their recording contracts were canceled. They were no longer asked to do commercials. They were no longer able to speak to the media. Their voices were silenced. Mr. Sakamoto's voice was not silenced because he had become part of a larger network. He was not limited by the government that controlled those other people, by the media and the Keidanren that controlled those other people. And that gave him the freedom to speak to all of us. And that freedom is really important. And this is where Dr. Walker's statements about the roles of single individuals speaking out with wisdom and knowledge becomes truly important. Each of these people talked about how we honor our society or we shame our government when it does not honor our society. And that is the call we must all face today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dana. I have to say, when the earthquake hit Japan, I was in Hayama at the undergraduate University for Advanced Studies. And for the following 4 days, I was watching news and I was very frustrated that the TVs and mainstream media did not give us the information on time. When the first explosion with reactor number 1 occurred, we weren't told what was going on for about an hour and a half. Japan is a country where it's a tiny, teeny earthquake on the tip of Hokkaido. Usually, after 1 minute, you see a news, one line on the TV screen saying there was an earthquake. And I couldn't believe what was going on. And I thought, well, this is bad. Hopefully, it'll get better. And then the second time with the explosion of reactor number 3, the same thing happened. And the information flow was delayed again with the third explosion. And at that point, it became very clear that if something happens, we will not be informed. And it was shocking, but I see a hope that people who are frustrated, who used to think, well, whatever we say will not change things. Now, after, I think, the earthquake and the Fukushima accident, many more people feel we need to say what we think is important, and I still have hope. And in that regard, I think what Dana said is very important. Now, I know that we're pressed with time, but I have to say that we have 2 people from Fukushima who came all the way just to be here, and I would really like to get a few words from the 2 professors from Fukushima, Professor Yasuo Goto of Fukushima University, and Dr. Nobuyo Goto of Fukushima Medical University. I think Bertrand can translate.
Hello everyone, my name is Nobuyo Goto, lecturer of Fukushima Medical University. Yesterday I just came from Fukushima, so I'd like to speak in Japanese because we have tremendous good translator here. 坂本先生、坂本教授、ジャスト教授、私たち教授といったら坂本龍一さんのことです。教授の話を聞きに福島から参りました。教授が最後に今の日本の政治状況についてお話ししましたが、一つだけお話しさせていただきたいと思います。それは、ビジネスマン。じゃあビジネスマンはワンジェネレーションのことしか考えておりませんけども、先ほどお話ししてくださったように、グローバルボディを考えているのは女性たちで、今草の根の女性たちが未来のこと、それから子どもたちのことを考えて草の根で運動を起こしています。それは大岡さんがおっしゃった通りです。これが水俣から全て伝わっております。ありがとうございます。
In Japan, when we say professor as a nickname, we all mean Ryuichi Sakamoto. That's the way he has been known in the media. And he mentioned that politicians are the ones who we need to counter in order to get our opinions across. But also, businessmen are ones who only consider one generation for their own benefits. But in Japan, I really think that I agree with him in terms of we need to think about the global body and the global effects of what we are doing currently. In Japan, now it's the women with children who are working on a grassroots level because they're the ones concerned about the next generation. I think it's they that we have hope in, and it all leads from the Minamata times, the disease situation, to the current situation, that we need to think about the next generations.
In my conclusion, I'd like to say one word. This battle is not only the battle of Fukushima, but also the battle of global future. We all humankind. Thank you.
Okay. I really want to continue the conversation, but we're actually 10 minutes over, so we have to end today. But as you know, Sakamoto-san is playing his piano this evening, and I hope most of you got the tickets. We sold out all the tickets completely. So if you didn't get the ticket, and if you like what he said today, please encourage him to come back here again. I hope that he will come back here in the near future. And